Okay, I'm gonna get started. I think it's that time, but if people trickle in after the fact, that's like not a problem at all. So as I've said, I'm on like a really questionable Wi-Fi network. So if I start to cut out, someone please just like raise your hands SOS so that I don't like in a really cringe way keep talking for like 30 entire minutes. Basically, I want to say first, thank you to everyone who joined this call. It's literally so sweet of you to make the time to want to hear about my work, and I will literally never forget your kindness. I want to say second that this call is being recorded. So if you object to being recorded, either like leave now and forever hold your peace, or just turn off camera and mute. It's being recorded basically for the Hong Kong Design Trust, which is also the group that's underwriting the grant that I've been on for about the last year. And how this call is going to go, which I literally just said, but basically I'm going to talk about myself and my work and kind of how I got to this place for about 30 minutes, and then Erin's going to mediate like a Q&A session. So if you have questions, just type them in the comment box or like PM them to Erin and she can say them out loud. So without further ado, I'm going to talk a bit about myself and my work. Basically, the place where I want to begin is about 4 years ago when I was wrapping up my undergrad studies in landscape architecture. I was really interested at the time, and to some extent I still am, in like different definitions of wilderness and kind of the idea of landscape wilderness, which is a pretty like layered and problematic term for like myriad reasons. The way that I remember encountering it at the time was kind of through expats in Hong Kong that I'd met who were kind of using the trope of wilderness to describe different parts of Southeast Asia that they'd traveled to. And I think that this definition of wilderness, landscape as wilderness, very much subscribes to a metric system where wilderness acquires value through associations with the female figure, namely the idea that like the untouched landscape or the virginal landscape has more value, and the ravaged landscape that's overrun with tourists has been depleted somehow. And I, for very obvious reasons, found it incredibly sickening, but also it's completely prevalent like throughout and across Western culture. Like geographers such as Bill Cronin have written fairly extensively about kind of why the wild was never truly wild, or why dividing the world into wilderness versus developed landscapes basically serves the colonial interest of imperial powers. And I think on a personal level, my reaction to this was that I was becoming increasingly interested in the idea of a digital landscape. And I think the extent to which the digital landscape that's defined by, you know, fiber optic cables and Wi-Fi signals and data clouds, the extent to which that kind of served as a wilderness in and of its own right, that I think kind of in an imaginary sense was probably as unknowable and as complex as like the New World was to 15th century colonial explorers. And I think in some ways, if we're describing the digital landscape as wilderness, I think the metaphor to the female body in some ways still works. I think online spaces kind of accumulate a perceived value before they become mainstream or corporatized or colonized, as in the case of like Facebook, where everyone's grandma is like super cringe commenting on everyone's stuff. And that is kind of becomes then the ravaged landscape, if you will. I think the coordinates of this digital landscape, like in a spatial sense, are probably defined by like every time we kind of ping a Wi-Fi signal in our phone, every time we send a text, every time we take a photo and upload it into the cloud. That kind of every time a surveillance camera or a video camera creates video documentation of a space. That begins to create kind of a spatial footprint for the digital landscape or digital wilderness, if you will. So fast forward about 3 years to the inception of the project that I'm talking about today, which basically it began, this project is very concerned with surveillance, and it began with a surveillance map of Shenzhen civic area that I made about this time last year, which is a focal public space in Shenzhen. The idea with this map was that I'd taken like GIS data that my boss had in the office at the time, and then I basically just like visited the space, and everywhere there was a cell phone surveillance camera, I just like pinged the location in the map, and then I measured the focal distances just based on like the product sales information online to create like a measured surveillance map of like how much of this space was like literally surveillable and literally being transmutated into digital space through visual surveillance at any given moment. And this summer was like a fairly tumultuous one, of course. It was summer 2019, and the Hong Kong protests were like really kind of a really dramatic and profound, in many ways, incredibly beautiful statement. And I was living in Hong Kong, but commuting to work across the border in Shenzhen. So I also kind of was able to notice a like doubling or tripling or quadrupling of surveillance infrastructure on the flip side as those protests were happening. And for reference, Hong Kong and Shenzhen are about like 13 kilometers apart, so not very far at all. Surveillance is like, it's a tricky subject, and I think it's a term that's weaponized by multiple sides pretty much constantly. Foucault described surveillance very extensively in Discipline and Punish, and basically his thesis is that, like, you know, if there, or a part of his thesis is that if there's a camera in a room, it doesn't matter like that we know the extent to which that camera can see the room, or even that we know that there's a person on the other side of that camera. If there's the camera in the room, our behavior becomes modified. And I think that's definitely, I think, kind of probably my key take on why surveillance in and of itself might be problematic or dangerous. But one kind of huge trepidation I had with making this surveillance map of mainland China, I think stemmed from the fact that at the end of it all, I was a white male American living abroad in China. And I don't know the extent to which I was comfortable or am comfortable at this time, like making kind of a value judgment about the Chinese Communist Party, only in the sense, I mean, I will make multiple value judgments because I'm a person with a consciousness who makes value judgments, but I am also just kind of very acutely aware of like the fact that at the end of it, I'm a white man moving abroad to ostensibly the developing world to say like, how egregious is this, you know, the extent of surveillance over here. So, and I think one realization or kind of understanding I had about surveillance in China is that I think surveillance is to some extent, like the act of literal security cameras and like visual surveillance is very much it's very much an expression of Fordism, or the manufacturing economy. And to back up this claim, which of course China is very much a Fordist economy in the sense that there's primary production and manufacturing. And I think to back up this claim, I'm interested in pointing out Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon project, which was basically a very textbook architecture project in the 18th century in the UK. And the idea of the Panopticon is that like there's a cylindrical tower, and at the core of the tower are where the guards in management work, and around the periphery of the tower is where like the workers and the proletariat work. And so at any given moment in this architectural experience, the person, the management person in the center of the tower can see out into all of the all of the periphery rooms, but none of the workers can see back in. And so it's describing exactly like the Foucault kind of dilemma that I was talking about, which is that even if those workers weren't being watched, they knew that they could be watched, and so their behavior was modified. And of course, like, so that was, I think in some ways that in the 18th century in the UK, and I'm sure similar kind of ideas were happening in America during the Industrial Revolution, I think that to some extent is like what we see in China right now. I think, you know, the economies of Fordism, and I'm paraphrasing Mark Fisher here, but basically they create societies of control around enclosed spaces like the prison and the factory. So people are controlled by the government or by whomsoever the power in charge might be by like literal physical enclosure. And I think visual surveillance cameras are an expression of that. In societies of post-Fordism, like America and Europe right now, and again, I'm paraphrasing Mark Fisher, but like societies are controlled based around like the ideas of debt and of lifelong learning. If the controlled figure, or if the enslaved figure in the manufacturing society is the worker or the prisoner, the controlled figure in the white collar economy is the debtor and the addict, basically. The idea that like, you know, we are still being controlled if we spend our entire lives in medical and in academic debt. And, you know, also the ideas of like working from home or like chilling at work. Those are very much ways of kind of controlling and monetizing our entire lives. And then finally, this is to say like literally nothing of the fact that the American government carries out surveillance projects that are as or more egregious than those carried out in China, as laid bare by the Snowden leaks in 2013, which basically showed that, you know, the US government doesn't need to be hanging like security cameras on every public space if they're monitoring our cell phone data and our phone calls and our text message logs, then they ostensibly have control of us. But nonetheless, I think being in China, I think the experience of visual surveillance is something that in an architectural sense, it's really spatial, it's really, I don't know, it's really isolating and alienating. And so I think I did respond to it in a really visceral way. And I think the conclusion I was coming to at the end of all this surveillance talk was kind of similar to the conclusion that I was coming to at the end of my undergrad degree about the idea of like a digital wilderness and kind of the footprint of digital space, and the idea of a digital landscape that basically exists like not only separate from our physical landscape, but that is actively like usurping and surpassing our physical landscape in terms of relevance. So in China, my thoughts about kind of the digital, you know, the digital technical landscape at the expense of the physical very much stemmed from the idea of urban air quality. I remember one day I was walking around probably Shenzhen, and I had this kind of cynical realization because the smog there is like so oppressive and so horrendous and unhealthy. I had the kind of sudden realization that, you know, before the government cleans up the urban air quality, they're literally just going to create some kind of like biochip or contact lens that just makes us see in higher saturation and higher contrast so that we can't perceive air pollution, because that's basically just a simpler fix. And that's the expansion of the digital and the technical at the scale of our bodies and at the expense of the physical landscape, because the physical world is allowed to then rot because our digital and technical selves no longer inhabit it fully. And in America, like, my God, I mean, the infrastructure is literally crumbling from like half-baked renderings of Elon Musk's Hyperloop, like, which are literally probably the most aspirational thing we get in terms of like expansion of public infrastructure. Anna Katchian said on Red Scare podcast earlier this summer, and I very much agree with her. During the statue toppling in the name of Black Lives Matter, which was obviously very noble, very aspirational, but what Anna pointed out was that, you know, statues, public art, architecture in the physical realm are quite literally no longer relevant, because our bodies and our cities have been totally usurped by the avatars and spaces and communities that we've created online. And so I think a good example of how this occurs is basically the idea, or this being the expansion of a digital landscape, is the idea that, you know, every time we upload a photo into a cloud or a video onto Instagram, TikTok, whatever, we basically create a representation of ourselves that lives with agency separate of ourselves. So like what you guys are watching in this Zoom call right now is the digital representation of Stephen. Assuming this was recorded, like I could physically die and you could still be watching and responding to the recording of this lecture. So that digital representation or representation of the self is an actor that has agency. And every time we do, you know, upload a video into the cloud or social media or whatever, we multiply and we create more actors who exist only in digital space. And I think what is heartbreaking to me about this is not so much that we seem to be hurtling into a future where all of the public commons are completely surveillable, mineable, and controllable, though that is profoundly dark and scary. But I think what's so cynical about the expansion of the digital landscape, you know, in our digital selves and our digital representations of ourselves, is that it comes at the expense of our bodies and the physical or material or spatial plane that we otherwise exist in. And I mean, it's, you know, no surprise or secret that as tech has eaten more and more of our lives, we've become more and more medicated, more overweight, more underweight. We live in buildings that are profoundly poorly constructed and public transportation that's completely laughable. And, you know, the consequence of this state of decay that we live in is less and less every time we, you know, every time our relationships and our personalities are reduced to digital space. If I have a great online personality, it doesn't matter that the material plane I live in is shit, or at least it matters less and less with every time that online personality expands in perceived value. I think visual surveillance is an interesting, and the camera kind of in general as a tool is an interesting, they're very pivotal in this discussion of like digital and material planes, because the camera is the liminal space between the two. The camera represents the becoming digital of the physical. So when I'm filmed on a surveillance camera, and then that digital representation of me lives forever outside of my control, that camera is where I move from the material plane to the digital plane. So I want to fast forward again to the beginning of lockdown, which was in April probably. And I personally, as many of us were, was experiencing incredibly depressive and melancholic lows like I had literally never experienced in my life. And I think they occurred for myriad reasons that were both public and private, but I can't ignore the possibility that basically COVID and this period of lockdown very much represented the final usurping of the physical and material plane by digital and cyberspace. Like, I think we now live in a world where the digital realm literally has more currency than the physical realm, with very rare exceptions, sometimes no exceptions at all. We see our friends in digital space, we see our loved ones in digital space, go to work, we go to class. I mean, often it doesn't even matter so much how our bodies literally look physically if they look good digitally. I would personally posit that there's nothing more uncanny than meeting someone in real life who's like unattainably beautiful or funny online, and then watching them move through the world in an actual human body. Like, it's literal cognitive dissonance. And obviously that person has the last laugh, because if they are, if they're famous and successful online, then they could probably argue that their personality or even happiness in the material world like doesn't matter, because we ostensibly live online. So the work behind me is an installation that I hosted downtown in central Pennsylvania tonight, that basically was a meditation on power, control, and surveillance, and how each of these concepts is mediated in both digital and physical space. Okay. The work basically consists of 32 lightweight interlocking plywood triangles that interlock infinitely in any kind of random number of configurations, so there is an underlying geometric logic. Basically tonight, what happened during the installation was that I asked community members to book 15-minute appointments with the work, during which they basically had the opportunity to build their own work of architecture while being filmed on a centrally located CCTV surveillance camera. And my hope was that they would do anything as simple as like moving one piece 6 inches, but I was so excited to see that people of all ages, kids and old people, made incredibly ambitious and profound works of architecture in the space. So the view shed of the surveillance camera in the middle of the room was recorded to a cloud, but it was also projected live onto the walls of the gallery, which basically was meant to challenge the hierarchical relationship between the subjects who's being filmed and the subject who is watching. When the subject who's being filmed is able to see themselves being filmed, does the subject who is watching necessarily have power over them? And then during the appointments, basically visitors were left alone with the work. I left the room in an enclosed and windowless space to create and modify their experience, basically unselfconsciously and in their own image. So what this meant to me was the creation of 2 separate worlds inside the gallery: the physical material plane, which I personally am inhabiting right now, and then the digital representation of the gallery itself, which you are all watching through Zoom right now, but also which was recorded through the camera and then projected back onto the walls. I think the kind of transmutation of the image from physical space into the camera and then out of the projector onto the walls created a kind of wall of mirror or hall of mirrors effect where, basically you could see your reflection as you worked. And what that meant was that each appointment was basically a collaboration between the visitor and the digital avatar or representation of themselves. And the idea of a collaborative, modular, participatory architecture or building project is something that I've been interested in a while, because I think it challenges the historic assumptions of power between the architect hero and the subject who inhabits the city that the architect hero creates, right? That's like an insane unequal distribution of power. So that's where I was going with the idea of collaborative and participatory building projects. So when I first began creating this work, well, not when I first began it, but when I was fabricating it in June, I introduced it to my friend Jack just for feedback and critique. And his main comment was that he would be much less self-conscious to rearrange and build with the work if I was not present in the room watching him. Like, no one wants to play or express themselves what's in front of either a room of strangers or the person who's the artist who's literally created the work itself. And I was very moved by this response. It immediately made me think of the scene in Adam Curtis's BBC doc, Hypernormalization, where he introduces the first computer psychotherapist that was created at MIT in the 1960s called Eliza. And what Eliza was like a very like generation one computer algorithm that would just like say back to people some version of what they'd asked it in like their therapy appointment. So basically a like, how do you feel about that type response? But what the MIT group found was that people were like totally engrossed with this machine, even though they knew it was like a totally rudimentary computer, and they completely opened up to it about their personal lives. And I felt there might be something similar about this work, and the idea that we do kind of, even though it's literally just interlocking plywood triangles, we get to open up to it, and we get to kind of, there's something very psychological and very personal about kind of projecting ourselves physically into the gallery space. So from there, and kind of based on that experience, I became very enraptured in the idea of conceiving this work as a series of therapy appointments by different community members with the sculptural objects. And luckily, this was obviously perfect because of COVID and the situation of pandemic we're in, which meant that like the mechanisms by which we usually view artwork, i.e. in public and in large groups, are no longer necessarily like safe. And even if they are safe enough, they're very exclusionary to like certain members of the public. So the idea of like therapy appointments, it was perfect. And I think I also really loved the idea of the gallery space as this kind of sterile, clinical, medical cube. Architecture and art historians have written about this extensively, but I'll paraphrase Brian O'Doherty, who basically wrote that it's no coincidence that like modern design, like the advent of modern design happened after the discovery of tuberculosis in the 1880s and before the discovery of its cure in the 1940s. So like his thesis being that, you know, it's no coincidence that Le Corbusier's buildings were what we would call clinical, sterile, whitewashed, because the society and the culture at large was so preoccupied with disease and sickness at the time. In many ways, we still are. And I think the idea of presenting these appointments as therapy appointments, it also, I think, works because it parallels the assumptions of hierarchy and consent that are made in real therapy appointments. You know, as in a real therapist appointment, we have a sense of privacy. The visitor has a sense of privacy when they enter this space and engage with this artwork because they're alone in a physical sense. But, you know, as is the case with real therapy appointments, this sense of privacy is illusory because they're being filmed and watched through film, you know. And in a real therapist appointment, obviously there's patient doctor confidentiality, but that's based on assumptions of trust for the therapist, institutional longevity for the institution of therapy and the institution of the government, and also legal contracts. I mean, you know, the privacy is in many senses illusory. And, you know, I think also the illusion of privacy with a therapist, it's meant to soften what is kind of otherwise a jarring hierarchy of a doctor-patient relationship, which is laid very bare in medical bills and contracts. So I want to conclude with a thought that I have mused with my colleague ALM kind of over the past year, which is that the pivotal act in high technology design of the future will be consent. And I basically kind of repeated some version of this to every person as they showed up to their appointment tonight, and we're kind of like, what? I'm going to be like filmed and my video will be sent to Hong Kong. But I mean, when you think about it, anytime we go to a painting opening, there's an exhibition photographer there photographing the crowd. Anytime we visit the High Line or, God forbid, the Vessel in New York, there are surveillance cameras that are literally filming our experience. You know, and none of these acts are consensual, like, at all. No one, no one, we're used to at this point not being asked whether or not, whether our photo will be taken. And I think through this lens, what ALM and I have kind of speculated is that the city of the future is going to be a negotiation between the desire to experience and the desire to be a completely autonomous individual. So, if we want to experience something that's artistic, like the Vessel or the High Line or a painting opening, if we want to experience something that's efficient, like ordering things from Amazon, if we want to experience something that's brings us dopamine, like forming a community on Facebook, we are doing that at the expense of our autonomy and, our ability to be a completely autonomous individual who's in control of his or her data. So yeah, this project traveled back from Hong Kong to Central PA when I left the territory in January. Owing to a number of factors, but the kind of quick pandemic spread of COVID-19 was like not in the least. And I thought that I would get to go back to Hong Kong in May or over the summer, but because of how things have been, there hasn't been a good time to make that trip. And so it, in many ways, a really important chapter of my life was completely shut without any prior knowledge, or I guess with 24 hours prior knowledge. And the work kind of came home with me. I refabricated it all here, but because it is on a grant with Hong Kong Design Trust, the video files for each community member's visit are going to be basically sent back to Hong Kong, and to what extent they will live on as digital representations of ourselves, I'm not sure of at this time. But in this way, the project of surveillance as it existed in this gallery and in this project, it's, as I hope I've explained with some degree of clarity, it's literally no different from the ubiquitous sharing of photos and data and experience that we are doing all the time digitally. So, with all that said, I guess like if Erin wants to like mediate and kick off with some questions, I will be really, really excited to respond.
Great job.
Thank you. I was like, you're gonna be like, your mic was off the entire time. Yeah.
I have a question from Neeraj.
Okay, fabulous.
So Neeraj asks, is the desirability of digital notoriety, which you pointed out has an inverse relationship kind of with the deterioration of the physical world, do you think that that's something that was consciously spurred by the interests of those who are destroying the physical natural world? Like, do you think that the individual ego and its embrace of like the possibility of fame and notoriety on the digital realm is something that is like consciously spurred by the deterioration and those who are deteriorating the natural world?
I don't know if by digital notoriety, do you mean like the Insta famous thought, or do you mean like Mark Zuckerberg? Because it was definitely consciously spurred by like the Mark Zuckerberg class and their equivalent in like CCP China. I mean, I think the expansion of tech to like, brush over the footprints of what an uninhabitable mess our material plane has become very conscious. And I think those interests, the extractive powers and the tech oligarchs are 100% in cahoots to get conspiratorial. But in terms of like the actual insta thought, him or herself, I think it's unconscious, and I think the insta thought who craves digital notoriety is, I mean, maybe it's because I am so glass half full, but I think that they are a victim in this process. I mean, there's something so uncanny about seeing like Kylie Jenner's filler, which looks so amazing in digital space, but then seeing her like move through the world and you're like, it looks so uncomfortable and uncanny, and like, it's, you know, I don't know, I guess I think her, in some ways her body like is deteriorating, but I don't think that is, I'm sympathetic. I think the insta thoughts are a casualty, is what I'm trying to say.
I have kind of a galaxy brain question, if you're down to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my question is kind of like a variation on the classic, if a tree falls in the middle of the forest, no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound, whatever. You've spoken a lot about the way that the digital landscape and the surveillance of its participants affect the way that we act within it.
Mm-hmm.
And this just makes me think of like the classic quantum physics photon observer experiment, in which like a photon behaves differently depending on whether or not it's being observed. And so like the idea of this experiment was basically just that like when light is not being observed, it behaves as a wave and therefore exists essentially as like a function of uncertain states. And then it's only upon being observed that the wave function collapses and light begins to act as a discrete particle, as a photon, like existing in the physical realm.
Insane.
And so this implies not only that the act of observing something changes its state just by observing it, but then, as many kind of like new agey consciousness types would suggest, that the act of observation itself is what causes something to exist in the physical world. So basically, like if a tree falls and no one's around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how that plays into the elements of surveillance that you've presented in this work, and how surveillance, and particularly I think you brought up like the camera and the lens as kind of like the observer, affects the object and like its presence in the digital space.
Okay.
Galaxy brain ass.
I have a short form answer and a long form answer. Okay, the short form answer would be that the difference is that like surveillance, the being watched by surveillance is a gesture of voyeurism. Like it's not like no one's watching me but the surveillance camera. It's like I'm already being watched and then there's one more who I'm not even trying to like pay attention to or include in this conversation, right? So I think that is like, I don't think that surveillance is a question of like, if a tree falls in the woods, did someone see it? Because it's like, it's there are n number of people plus one, the plus one being the surveillance. Okay, my long form like spiritual answer. I kind of went into this on a recent podcast episode that we accidentally deleted, but basically I recently watched, what was it? It was also an Adam Curtis BBC documentary called Century of the South. And it is kind of like an overview of Freud's ideas about like the id and the ego. So if I may describe Freud, mansplain Freud through the lens of Adam Curtis, I think the idea of like the id and the ego, according to Freud, was that like the id is like the core self that's like irrational and impulsive and in many ways still animal, and the ego is like the skin that we wear when we like hang out with people and present ourselves and like talk. It's like the ego is how we like culturally normalize. And I think Freud's idea was that like Nazism in Europe was like through like crowd mentality, like the collective id had been like unleashed and the ego was no more. That's neither here nor there. I am totally unsure whether I subscribe to Freud or not. But I do think as someone who participated in theater growing up and in many ways is like familiar with the idea of performance, I think that like in many ways, like I think becoming an adult in my personal journey over like the last 4 years has been like, has meant like understanding that like there is like a Steven skin that I wear, like a Steven character that I play at all times. And I think that is my ego. I think when people describe an ego death, which I don't know that I've experienced, but I think it's like, it's the like crashing of that complex of like the me that I present. So I think that in that, and in that sense, okay, getting back to like, if a tree falls in the woods, did, like, I guess my thought would just be that like, it's like, if no one was there to see the ego, then what would I be? You know, like if I never once played the character of Steven with my friends, loved ones, self, groups, whatever, like then what would what would happen to like the essence of like myself, like the photon that like changes when it's being watched or whatever. That is like what I'm fundamentally doing when like I'm being watched by anyone, including myself. So I think like surveillance or just the act of being watched by anyone, I think that very much is like an exercise in like how we exist. And I don't, in a spiritual sense, know that like anyone can answer like to how we exist when we're not watched by literally anyone, including ourselves, because that's for God to know, I guess.
Nice. Good. You took that in a lot. You really ran with every part of it. That's okay, I have another question. So I want to know if this piece could have been done entirely virtually and had the same effect. Like rather than having physical bodies in a physical space put together physical pieces, could you just like basically give someone access to like a Minecraft server and like have them put virtual pieces together by clicking? Like what's the essential difference there, or is there not one?
I think that what that question makes me think of is like definitely the moment of like critique in June when I was showing Jack the artwork and he was like, I want to be alone with it if I'm going to be moving it around because I don't want to be like self-conscious being watched by someone else while I do this. And because I think if it were like, if the entire project were performed in like a Minecraft type simulation, then I don't think that would have happened in the same way. And actually, to backpedal like 4 minutes or so, like I think I think that idea of like not wanting to be watched with something very much is a question of like id and ego. I think that's a question of like the extent to which we can like peel back our ego to like kind of do something like imaginative or unexpected in front of other people, right? And so I think that that relationship of like self-consciousness between ourself and our presentation of ourselves played out in a very specific way for this project, where basically people were more comfortable behaving when they weren't being watched or monitored. And I guess I just am I'm unsure how that would have happened, because like, you know, are we more or less, in many ways I think we're less self-conscious in digital space. I think that's why you get like abhorrent hate speech in like anonymous like internet platforms, is like, I think I think digitally there is some kind of like peeling back of the ego that's like very jarring. So I think it just would have been a different project, but it would have addressed, I guess, like some, I mean, maybe that's what comes next for me. My first computer game. Um, cool.
Nice. Um, okay. So you mentioned how tuberculosis kind of like informed the architecture of the physical world during like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I'm wondering if you have like predictions or thoughts on how COVID is or will shape the digital architecture of like the present moment.
Ugh. Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it because I'm like literally starting a master's of architecture program in like a week, and I'm sure there are going to be like so many like freshman studio projects up in here that are like design a pop-up medical campus for Central Park. And I think that's aspirational, and I think that's very much the type of work that comes out of universities is like, how can we be handling disease better and more equitably? But I don't know that that's I definitely don't think that's a reflection of like where we're about to go. I mean, I think that's like when I talked about how I was getting like really darked out during COVID about um how helplessly isolated I was due to the fact that like the only way I communicated with my loved ones was digitally. The only way I enjoyed myself was digitally. Like, I think that is, I think there will just be like a way more ubiquitous takeover of our lives like by digital space. Like, I mean, that's why like work from home is like so insanely creepy, because if we're like, I think the more time that we spend like building community in digital space, the more uncanny it becomes to see someone like actually walk with two legs. And I also think, going back to the idea of like skin Stephen or the performance of Stephen that I very much exist as, I think when I've been only communicating digitally, I often notice like a dissonance when I then physically try to like express myself in a way that would like ordinarily be very natural. And I think that's what's so dangerous about isolation, is that like that kind of it's just gonna start feeling more and more uncanny to like express ourselves in like the material plane. But hey, I mean, maybe like kids 100 years from now will be like, who needed the material plane? Joke's on you. I love the material plane because I'm sentimental.
That was literally going to be my next question. Yeah, I think I'll ask my next and maybe last question,
Okay, cool.
which is basically an extension of that, which is like, what, like, you have skin Stephen that exists in the physical world as like as your ego. Is
Right.
the ego that you express in the digital world a separate Stephen, or is it like another level on top of Stephen? Like, do they exist like at the same level of each other, but in different realms, like physical and digital? Or is it like an abstraction of physical world Stephen that exists in the digital? And I guess like to kind of play off of what you just said about sentimentality, like just as like our soul or our consciousness learns to exist in a human body in the physical world, is that something that like our soul and consciousness could do for the digital world? It's just a matter of like what we're accustomed to and we're attached to or sentimental about.
Yeah, amazing question. I think that like, I mean, the thing about the physical plane is that like there is biological evolution. Like we very much like, I don't know, I think over like, it's a bit like invasive species in the sense that like, okay, sure, it's like xenophobic to be a native plants guru and to kind of like exile and shun out all invasive species, or the idea of ecological change. But at the end of it, our like native ecosystems did evolve over thousands of years and therefore have like a level of complexity that like, you know, if like the entire Northeast is taken over by kudzu and like deer, that's like, you know, fully two species. So I think it would probably be, my inclination would be to say that it's something similar in terms of like our soul kind of like, or our ego becoming digital, or like becoming the digital ego instead of the physical ego. Like I think that like I think it probably would happen, but I definitely think it would be like much less like nuanced, complex, virile, to say the least. So yeah, that, what was the first half of the question?
I asked like if like Skin Steven in the physical world and like Steven in the digital world are like just two separate but
Oh, right.
but equal representations of your ego, or is one an abstraction of like your physical?
Uh, uh, there can be no separate but equal, as a wise woman once said. I think that like the no, but I mean, I guess for me, and I'd be curious to hear your experience as well, like in terms of like my ego in digital space, or like Skin Steven, like but expressed digitally, like I definitely know, like, okay, in text message, I was like, I'm so down. Or like, oh my God, oh my God. Like, I mean, there are like literally ways I talk in the same way that like there are ways that I talk that are like flippant and reductive, like in the material plane, right? Like, I mean, but I think my inclination would, like digital ego is like, it exists, like I think it's like it's related to the physical ego, but it's also like an entirely different person. That is my, like it's a different performance. It's it's the same musical, different cast, is what I would say. um yeah, do you agree?
Yeah, I think I do agree. And I also like, I feel like there are moments where like my digital self informs my physical, like, okay, like let's say I pick up slang from Twitter, like tea, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah, yeah.
Like I can remember like the first time that I said tea aloud, and like I had typed it, I don't know how many times prior. And so like that was a way, I think a lot of times like our physical self informs our digital self because that's what came first. But I
Right,
think like they can go both ways, and like your digital self can like teach your physical Skin Stevens self things as
right. Yeah, or like I mean, I guess the like the relevant example, like okay, so if like seeing Kylie Jenner's filler move through material space is uncanny, the equivalent example would be someone who's like so big on Twitter, but like meeting them in real life and just being like, this isn't, it's not the same media, you know, and it's not the same like representation of yourself. Like you have a personality, but it is digital, and I'm experiencing the physical one in this moment. Um, that said, I feel like on this Zoom call, I am being pretty like ego Skin Steven. So maybe the hypothesis was like not even real all along. Like, I don't know. I mean, if there is like a digital Steven, I don't feel like I'm performing as that right now just because this is like a digital video feed. I feel like I'm talking to you guys in the same way that I would like if we were all in the same room, basically.
I've learned to exaggerate more via Zoom because you're muted. Like I'll like purposefully like do things to show that I'm listening or to show a response. Like I'll go like this or like something like that, which I
You're
wouldn't do
fine.
if I was like in front of you.
Sure. Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, cool.
But yeah, Well, I think if there are no more questions, then we can wrap up the Q&A session. Stephen, do you wanna outro?
I mean, as I said in the intro, thank you so much everyone for coming. I will literally never forget the kindness and how much it means to me. See you all soon, I hope, in material space, no less. Okay, bye. Literally bye.
Bye.
Okay, and